Everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We are going to give another 2 minutes to our participants to join. We had more than 150 people signing up today, so we hope we're going to see many more people joining. Okay, I think let us get started. I'm going to just share my screen. Okay, welcome everyone again, and thank you for joining. We are having quite an exciting webinar ahead of us. So as you may know, the CSIR has launched a human settlement report, which is one of the last 2 reports. And today we have also Linda and Jeremy with us online. And Jeremy is the lead researcher who's going to take you through the technical report, and Professor Linda Godfrey is the manager of Circular Innovation South Africa. So I'm just going to quickly speak around about CSA, why circular economy is so important, and then I'll hand over to Linda to speak a bit about Circular Innovation South Africa. And then Jeremy is going to present the Human Settlements Technical Report, and right at the end we're going to have a Q&A. So if you have questions, please just use the chat function. You can also use the Q&A function, and we're just going to filter that through. So CSA is amplifying the potential and value of the just circular economy transition across South Africa. Why do we believe in a circular economy? Well, South Africa is an extractive-based economy, which has led to resource depletion, social inequality, and environmental degradation. And I'm just have teased out the key findings of the UCT study that was conducted based on data in 2017. Where, well, we all know that our economy is very much dominated by export-orientated extractives. So we're extracting a lot, we mine a lot of the resources, but then we are exporting them. And that is quite sad because we have quite a low rate of domestic stock building, so investing into our own infrastructure. And I'm sure Jeremy will unpack that a little bit more just now. Our economy is very much dominated by fossil fuels, and we are importing oils into the country. We do have high pockets of circularity, but that mainly is driven by the informal sector and the waste reclaimers that are actually going through our waste and taking plastics and other valuable materials back to recycling centers or to sell them off. We do have quite a bit of bioflows, so especially our agriculture and forestry sector that is flowing through our economy, but there also the big concern is around the wastage that is taking place in this sector. So at the moment, South Africa is believed to be around about 6% circular. So there's quite a lot of opportunities in the system to do better. So we believe that circular economy provides South Africa with a regenerative alternative to the current system. And we are also aligning with the 3 global fundamental principles on circularity around designing out waste and pollution, keeping materials at their highest value, regenerating natural systems, and we're always adding the fourth principles, which is really around benefiting all members of society. Circular economy provides a cross-sectoral system approach, and then you obviously have the opportunities across the sectors that are interconnected. And these are, I'm just teasing this out, but these are the sectors that the CSIR has focused on that are resource intensive, where we also have lots of opportunity to actually implement circularity in those systems. Human settlements, I think for us, or what I also envision there, is really around developing of thriving settlements that incorporate green building practices, water sensitive designs, and really enabling continuous resource circulation within and between neighborhoods, but also cities that we do have in our country. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Linda to share a little bit around circular innovation in South Africa. Linda, please take it away.
Thanks, Katharina. I'm just going to share one slide quickly. There we go. Hopefully you can see that and on full screen.
Perfect.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to just present essentially the context of how we got here today of the Human Settlements and Circular Economy report. I think it was around about late 2020, we started reflecting on this issue that we saw, the discussion growing stronger and stronger about in terms of the circular economy. And within the CSIR, we asked this question: what does the circular economy mean for us as South Africa, as a developing country? A lot of the discussion was coming out of the EU, for example. It was driven by initial concerns around access to resources, critical raw materials. We saw the discussion then emerge further into addressing some of the big environmental challenges that are associated with resource extraction and processing. And then during the pandemic, there was this discussion around a green economic recovery, build back better, that there are socio-economic opportunities in transitioning to a more circular economy. And so as an organization, we really asked this question: what does the circular economy mean for South Africa? Is resource scarcity a driver for South Africa to transition to a more circular economy? Is climate mitigation, achieving our NDCs, a reason for South Africa to transition to a more circular economy? And what does it mean within different resource intensive sectors of our economy? And so we commissioned the first 3 studies. It looked at this issue around resource scarcity. So it delved into our mining sector and identified that, in fact, yes, resource scarcity is a driver for South Africa to transition to a more circular economy. We then looked at agriculture and manufacturing, 2 very resource intensive sectors. We know that agriculture, for example, is a significant user of water, I think 61%, if I'm not mistaken, but contributes about 3% to GDP, but so critical in terms of food security. So again, how do we utilize resources within our agriculture and manufacturing sector? We then went on to look at the climate mitigation to understand that driver, and it showed, yes, it is. Transitioning to a more circular economy in just 3 sectors had the potential to actually stabilize emissions between now and 2050. And there's further work that the CSR is doing around understanding that as well from a materials perspective and the climate opportunities. We then looked at energy and water, just given the constraints that we had faced in those 2 sectors, the rolling blackouts we've essentially had since 2008, the load shedding, and how that's impacted the economy. And then water, we've seen the impact of that on the droughts down in the Western and Eastern Cape. And so those were the next 2 studies that followed. We left human settlements and mobility until last because they were probably the most complex in terms of dealing with. They also involved a lot of the other issues dealt with in the other studies, but are also 2 sectors that perhaps provide some of the biggest opportunities for circular interventions. And so we left those until last, and those 2 studies were released earlier this month. And I'm really pleased to be partnering with Circular South Africa to share the findings of those 2 studies. But I think that, the work that the CSR has published to date really does highlight that the circular economy is very relevant for South Africa. It's not just about waste management. I think there, if I'm not mistaken, something like 107 different circular interventions that have been identified across the different studies. And from upstream, from the design, you spoke to the principles just now, from design, keeping resources at highest value, but also designing out wastage in the way that we live, the way that we provide goods and services, the way we move goods and services around the country. So I'm really excited to hear the presentation that Jeremy's going to present us now about the Human Settlements CSR report. And I think next month we'll be having a similar webinar about the mobility report. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jeremy. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Let me also just share my screen. Right. Can I just check that you can see the full
Yep.
screen?
Perfect.
Right.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Great. Thank you very much, Katharina and Linda, for the introduction. It's very useful, I think, to give that context, because you'll see from the study, we follow very much a kind of broader approach to thinking about the circular economy, and how it's relevant, particularly to South Africa and to where we are in terms of development. So what I'm going to do is go through the report. The report's accessible, so I won't go through all the detail. I will give you a link at the end so that you can download the report later. So in terms of what I'm going to cover is I'll cover the objectives and the background, what we set out to do. I will describe the methodology we followed, the results, again, key aspects of the results, and what we tried to do to make the findings easier to work with is look at some themes and specific modeling of some of the opportunities that we identified. I'll then finish off with some conclusions, recommendations, and we can have some questions and discussion. So just in terms of the objectives, objectives were very straightforward: to understand the implications and potential of the circular economy for human settlements. And we would like to acknowledge funding by the Department of Science and Innovation, and also acknowledge all the work done by Linda in terms of coordinating the different aspects and how this particular study fitted in with some of the other studies. And this piece of work was a team effort. There were a whole range of different people working on it. Karsten, Beertre, and Berger worked on the modeling aspects, and Mans, Gerbrandt, Cooper, Napier, and Cooper and Napier worked much more on the surveys and getting data back on the surveys, and then Linda and I and the rest of the team really worked in terms of the content and developing the report. So in terms of the methodology was undertaken in 3 parts. First of all, there's a comprehensive desktop study. We looked at really understanding the existing current development paths that South Africa currently is following. We wanted also to identify relevant circular economy interventions. So what were the kind of things that could have an impact in South Africa, and what are the implications for human settlements? The second part of the methodology looked at testing out potential ideas with stakeholders. So we identified a range of different stakeholders. We carried out focus groups, quite a detailed survey, and really to understand what was going on within the sector, and also what levels of support and awareness there were for some of the circular economy interventions. The last stage was to pick out the most promising interventions and then model these and say, if we followed this particular route, this particular option, what would it mean in terms of the development pathway for cities, for a particular human settlement, and then compare these with the current development pathways. So you could have a kind of contrasting set of data that we could look at, really to show the potential impact of a circular economy interventions. The second component, in terms of the desktop review. What we did is look in quite a lot of detail at current pathways. What are the implications in terms of future environmental, economic, social impacts of current development, and then draw on literature in terms of a lot of the existing interventions that were being explored internationally, but also in South Africa. In terms of the approach that we followed for the stakeholder survey, we worked very closely with UKESA, which is a database of human settlement stakeholders. It's quite a large database of material, and we drew on them to carry out the survey, and also then focused on particular focus groups where we then tested out and developed some of the findings in a little bit more detail during the study. The final stage, and I'm going to go and show you some of the results from the modeling, was to take particular promising circular economy interventions and model them, work them up and say what would happen if we applied this particular idea to a human settlement in Johannesburg. And so we used a range of different techniques to model up the benefits, the implications of a particular circular economy intervention. So let's move on now to some of the results that came through. And if we start off really with the desktop study, what we found, which is fairly widely known, is that there is very inefficient urban form and mobility in South Africa. Many people spend a lot of time and money traveling back and forth to work, to school, for shopping, etc. Limited access to services, things like social infrastructure, schools, clinics, etc. Mushrooming informal settlements around many of the cities in well-located positions. Increasingly unreliable energy and water supplies. We've fortunately reduced load shedding, but water is probably getting increasingly irregular in many provinces. Our building designs and operations are outdated. We haven't kept up with the latest technology, the latest approaches in terms of designs, and climate change generally is exacerbating a lot of the issues that we have in built environments and in human settlements. But what we also have is a range of initiatives that are aiming to start addressing some of these issues. So there's tightening legislation. A lot of you may know SANS 10400XA, which is focused on energy, and that is every 2 or 3 years is tightening the energy requirements for buildings. What we're also finding is that there's an increasing interest in innovative building materials and construction, IBTs or ABTs as they're sometimes called, and more buildings are being built of materials such as timber, hempcrete, etc. So there's increasing innovation and capacity within the universities and within industry around alternative construction. There's increasing interest in large-scale infrastructure investment. This was seen in the recent budget, but you also have Project of Vulundlela coordinating public-private investment. So there's potential for large-scale financial investment in infrastructure, and it's going to be important to make sure that we choose really the right types of technology, the right approaches. We are also finding that a lot of new business models are being developed as things like unreliable water and energy happens, what we're finding is entrepreneurs are stepping in and exploring product as a service models, putting in renewable energy systems at their cost, renting this to users, and there's a whole range of new business models that are appearing that have huge potential in terms of much more efficient, low-cost approaches. The last one is at a municipal scale. You have municipal service partnerships where municipalities partner with either communities or with entrepreneurs to provide bulk services. So things like water and energy on microgrid type scale. So all of these are very promising initiatives that are starting to happen. And there's something that we can work with when we look at the circular economy to say, how can we guide, how can we enable the circular economy to be drawn on as an inspiration with these new developments. The graph here shows really where South Africa is. So there's Johannesburg and Cape Town, which are some of the most inefficient cities, if you look at it in terms of land consumption, transport, etc. So we're very low, have a very low ranking in terms of urban and spatial efficiency. This next picture shows really the set of interventions that we identified as a group. So having gone through a fairly detailed literature review, we identified 17 key circular economy interventions that could be applied to human settlements. So 15-minute neighborhoods, a lot of you will be aware of those, and I'll go back to some of these later. Bio-based construction materials, composting, design for disassembly, energy as a service, equipment libraries, grey water systems, localizing the supply chain, loose fit, long life design, recycled content building products, reuse of materials and products for deconstruction, roof gardens, shared use facilities, smart sensors and connected technologies, sustainable urban drainage systems, SUDS, urban agriculture, and virtualization. And to really kind of get a handle on these, we grouped them, we themed them according to these four main areas. So localize, diversify, and enhance local access and opportunities. The second theme is regenerate productive ecosystem and services. The third one is harness partnerships and technologies to improve efficiency and access to services. And then the last one is embed circularity in new designs. So I'm going to come back to some of these ideas later, but they're also in the report if you want to read up on them. So the first exercise we carried out, having identified these 17 circular economy interventions, was to test it out on our stakeholders. And these are the results from the stakeholder survey. The first one was that there was a very strong consensus amongst the stakeholders that circular practices would be beneficial for human settlements. What we also found was that they were very supportive. The three most beneficial and appropriate circular interventions for human settlements were grey water reuse, localizing the supply chain, and urban agriculture. The three least beneficial circular interventions were bio-based construction, materials, composting, and reusing of materials and products. We then go to the next set of findings. So this particular survey question asked about the readiness to implement. How ready was South Africa? How ready are human settlements to implement some of these circular interventions? And the feedback was that virtualization, smart sensors and connected technologies, and shared use of buildings was scored as having the highest levels of readiness. The lowest levels of readiness were equipment libraries, design for disassembly, and bio-based materials. So these findings are shown in the graphs. The next set of questions in the survey aim to establish to what extent a lot of these interventions were actually in place, were actually being implemented. And the three most implemented circular economy interventions are virtualization, localizing the supply chain, and urban agriculture. The least implemented circular economy interventions included the design for disassembly, loose fit, long life design, and equipment libraries. So what we then did was to take really the feedback from the desktop study, the survey, and the focus groups, and really extract the key, most promising sets of circular economy interventions. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk through the broad theme and then show you some particular examples of the modeled results. So the first one is localize, diversify, and enhance access and opportunities. So these were aspects like 15-minute design principles, where you can walk to a lot of your kind of key facilities, so health, education, work, etc. And there are many benefits of that. Localizing the supply chain, this means making sure that when you are building, when you're maintaining buildings, you use local suppliers, local services instead of ones far away, and then you build a diversified, resilient local economy. And virtualization is really about using ICT, using the internet, using online services to reduce transport and reduce waste. So the first example here that we modeled was that we looked at the city of Joburg, and we took the current development projections in terms of the spatial development framework and looked at how the city would change if we followed 15-minute neighborhood principles in a much more concerted way. And what we found was that there would be an additional 100,000 households compared to the current trend that would be able to access primary schools, secondary schools, health facilities, and commercial buildings within a 15-minute walk by 2042. So a very substantial benefit could be achieved by following much more circular economy principles in terms of a 15-minute city. The next theme is around regenerating productive ecosystems and services. And again, there's a set underneath this. The first one was sustainable urban drainage systems, looking at making sure that stormwater drainage is dealt with locally. And there's a whole set of benefits associated with that, using biological means. Composting, composting locally instead of diverting organic waste to landfill, urban agriculture, and then increasing the use of bio-based materials, so things like timber for buildings. And what we did here was look at a particular example. We took Johannesburg and we did quite detailed modeling to look at potential land parcels near human settlements, so near housing that could be converted to urban agriculture. And through the modeling, what we found was about 320,000 tons of fresh produce could be targeted from these intensive allotment gardens near human settlements. And if you look at what were the requirements in terms of vegetable requirements for urban populations in these areas, the modeling suggested that about 20% of the vegetable requirements for about 10.3 million people. So 3.4 million households could be provided for from these kind of very intense agricultural allotments near housing. And it's a very interesting area because this is something that you do find in a lot of other African cities, so West Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, etc. And again, a very interesting finding because it links very nicely to water, it links very nicely to composting, and the social benefits in terms of food security, and much more affordable local food and jobs. So the next scheme that we modeled was to look at some detail in terms of the organic waste streams that came from buildings, from housing, and look at an alternative. So instead of these being diverted straight to landfill, what we modeled here was the potential of taking this all of this organic waste and composting it locally, so within neighborhoods, and creating small entrepreneurs, community groups, co-ops, etc., to compost this organic waste, and then obviously this would then be available for local urban agriculture, etc. So what the modeling showed is that about 550 kilotons, so roughly about 24% of the domestic waste could be diverted from landfill. So there's a huge reduction in the amount of waste that was directed to landfill. And secondly, about 5,000 full-time jobs could be created. And obviously linked to this are very large reductions in terms of carbon emissions because of the reduced transportation, etc. So very strong environmental benefits, but also very strong social and economic benefits for human settlements. The next broad theme that we explored was harness partnerships and technologies to improve efficiency and access to services. And the circular economy interventions that we looked at for this included smart sensors and controls that improve the ability to manage infrastructure and buildings and increase efficiency. So part of the thinking here is that if you've got smarter controls in buildings, you can control many aspects of buildings remotely: water consumption, energy consumption, lighting, air conditioning, etc. But you can also build in intelligence within those controls to reduce waste and consumption of utilities. The next one are the new business models, such as the product as a service models. And what we're finding is that there are an increasing number of entrepreneurs that are providing a service. So the service may be renewable energy, it might be water from rainwater harvesting systems, it might be hot water from solar hot water systems, it might be grey water systems. And the way this works is that an entrepreneur will provide and install the equipment. So it might be a renewable energy system, photovoltaic panels, the battery system, and they would then put in a meter, and the user in the building would then just pay for the amount of electricity that they used. And all of the capital cost of this equipment, all the maintenance would then fall on the entrepreneur. And this can be a very efficient way of operating because it avoids the capital costs. So it's a much more affordable way for users to access services. And the people who are most interested and most knowledgeable in terms of the provision of the equipment can manage it very efficiently, and they can upgrade it when needed. So it's a very efficient model potentially. The last example are things like grey water systems and rainwater harvesting systems, which enable you. So a grey water system recycles lightly soiled water, so takes water from showers and then enables you to use this for irrigation or flushing toilets. And in a house, for instance, up to 40% of your water consumption from potable water sources can be reduced. So there are very simple technologies that can enable huge reductions in wastage and a lot of efficiencies. So as some examples, this particular example we modeled was looking at housing. So we took grey water systems in housing, and we said basically that the amount of water that was generated in housing and then reused for flushing toilets and irrigation would have a marked reduction in terms of potable water consumption. And when we model this option, we found that about 300 megaliters could be saved, and this water could then be used to flush toilets and irrigation. And so obviously there's a huge reduction in potable water consumption that would have to be supplied by municipalities. And especially in the case of Gauteng, this water doesn't have to be transported all the way from Lesotho, etc. So there's multiple benefits. Another example is rainwater harvesting systems. So this particular option was modeled. We looked at harvesting rainwater off roofs, and we found that about 46,000 megaliters could be harvested. Again, this water could be used for flushing toilets, for irrigation, and there would be very significant savings in terms of potable water consumption that would have to be supplied by the municipality. Okay, so the last theme that we're going to look at, and interestingly enough, this was the least popular. And you can see in terms of the detail, it's very focused in terms of what architects and building designers might be interested in, but not necessarily a kind of mainstream human settlement option. So this theme really looked at designing buildings to be more flexible, more adaptable, easy to repair, easy to maintain, so that they could be accommodate change over their lifespan. And so buildings would last longer and not have to be demolished or refurbished regularly. It looked at making sure that materials with the lowest environmental impact, such as grown materials or bio-based materials, so things like timber, reused materials, recycled content, also how we could use those in buildings. And then lastly, at the end of a building's useful life, how do you deconstruct that building? How do you take apart all the materials, all the components, and then reuse those in new buildings? Or if you can't, at least recycle them and avoid them going through into landfill sites. So this particular theme, we looked at deconstruction and reuse of materials, and we looked at a very simple example where instead of buildings diverting most of the materials through to landfill, we looked at the option of a carefully planned approach where the building would then be carefully deconstructed and the materials then salvaged and reused in other buildings. What the modeling shows here is about 225,000 tons of building materials and components could be reused, so reused in other buildings. And in this particular case, about a 44% reduction of construction waste could be avoided. And a lot of this waste ends up in landfill or illegally dumped. So you also have the benefit of not damaging wetlands where there's illegal dumping, for instance. Right, I think I'm coming up to the last part of the study, which are the conclusions and recommendations. And what I'm going to do, again, is not go into all of the detail, but just cover the kind of broad principles. So the first element in terms of our question is that the kind of three most beneficial circular interventions in human settlements were greywater, reuse, localizing the supply chain, and urban agriculture. So that's the stakeholder feedback that we got. In terms of readiness to implement, virtualization, smart sensors, and connected technologies and shared use of buildings were scored very highly. These make sense. They're easy to implement. They're something that can be done very quickly and easily. And then lastly, in terms of actual implementation, respondents suggested that the most implemented circular economy interventions currently are virtualization, localizing the supply chain, and urban agriculture. So those were our conclusions for that component. What we've then done is look at recommendations really around the different themes. So in terms of localization, diversification, enhanced local access and opportunities, the modeling indicates substantial benefits can be generated from these areas, and these are some of the recommendations. So in order to make sure the benefits of circular economy interventions are integrated into human settlements over time, we need to integrate them into IDPs, into spatial development frameworks, and in particular, the idea around the 15-minute city. In terms of strategies for services such as education, health, and government services, there certainly appear to be potential for exploring virtualization to improve access, affordability, reduce transport requirements that could be explored. The same for e-government, knowledge workers, telemedicine. They're very good examples that work very well. And one of our recommendations is that we need to take those examples, pilot them, and where they work well, upscale those. The fourth one is local content policy, and we do have a local content policy in South Africa, but it's not as widely implemented and maybe not as locally implemented. So it's implemented at a country scale, and I think this certainly could be research and piloting done to explore how you could manufacture more materials locally and use them locally within buildings rather than import them from 100 to 200 kilometers away. So the next broad theme, the modeling and findings indicate that a regenerative circular economy development path has substantial benefits compared to conventional approaches. These are the recommendations. Again, we integrate some of these ideas into IDPs and SDFs and into city bylaws. In particular, sustainable urban drainage. We look at a lot of the flooding. We can address that through SUDs, urban agriculture, composting, regenerate natural systems, reducing stormwater infrastructure, and improving food security. So again, this needs to be integrated and thought through at an urban scale and then integrated into local plans within cities, within human settlements. Many NGOs work within the field of local agriculture, and one of the recommendations from the study says that there is lots of potential to upscale this. You can upscale composting schemes, food gardens, and there's multiple benefits of this approach. However, aspects like sustainable urban drainage is still relatively new to a lot of the professionals, and one of the things that's recommended is more technical guidance, training within the field, and the same applies to bio-based building products. So again, more research, more testing, encouragement of new bio-based materials, new manufacturing firms and products, and working with people like Agromount SA to get them certified. The next one is harnessing partnerships and technologies to improve efficiency and access to services. So again, the key finding here is that there are multiple benefits of looking at circular economy interventions within this area. And the specific recommendations are that human settlement policy and plans investigate partnerships that draw on municipal service partnerships to enable communities, entrepreneurs to work much more closely with municipalities to enable more renewable energy, water, waste services. And again, this is something that's already starting to be explored by some municipalities, certainly by the DBSA and National Treasury. Guidance on product as a service models could be developed. So we think there's a lot of potential in this model. How could it be expanded? How could we create a lot more services, access to services and jobs within an area in South Africa? The next one is, given the potential of smart technologies, we think it's important that there are recommendations in terms of more guidance, better training, the same thing in terms of grey water systems, and also equipment libraries. So the idea behind equipment libraries is to enable people to access particular equipment, and it may be a small contractor able to access things like cement mixers, etc., at low cost. So it gives them access to productive services. And again, it reduces waste because you have less equipment that's sitting idle, and it's more accessible. So there are many potential benefits that could be achieved. Okay, the last recommendation that I'm going to talk about is embedding circularity in new designs. This, again, probably is the kind of least well-known set of circular economy interventions. But in terms of recommendations, what we would recommend is the local government really thinks through how they can support deconstruction and reuse of building materials. Very easy to do in terms of bylaws, penalties, incentives, waste clubs, transfer depots. This is a fairly straightforward set of things that they could do that would reduce landfill and create a lot of additional jobs. Technical guidance in terms of circular approaches in the design of buildings. So a lot of universities could do this. It could be integrated in CPD for built environment professionals. And then the last one is extended producer responsibility policies. We find this in other products, and there's no reason why this shouldn't be applied to things like plasterboard, roof tiles, etc., where the manufacturer takes back waste, such as plasterboard, and then incorporates that into new products. And in that way, you avoid a lot of waste going straight into landfill. Good, thank you. I see Katharina's checking that I'm almost finishing, and I have. So thank you very much. what I'm just showing you on the screen is the website where you can download the report, and I'm very happy to answer questions where I can. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeremy, for this insightful presentation. I've also shared the report link in the chat, and we're going to also share the link on the follow-up email so that everyone has actually access to the report. But I think this gave a lot of food for thought. I'm just going to quickly share my presentation, because what we have done is actually we've taken the research from CSIR and put it in one infographic for each of the sectors. So if you guys want to have a bite-sized chunk, start with that one and then move over to the technical reports. Regarding questions and answers, I think Ronald has posted a question in the chat. I'm just going to read it out for everyone. So he said, I think circular human settlements will be enabled by regulations around zoning for mixed use and compact development, as well as land use planning or spatial/urban design permitting. Did the report consider these?
Okay, thank you. No, absolutely. So it's not described as zoning or mixed use. It's around the principle of a 15-minute city. So 15-minute cities almost by definition are mixed use, because what has to happen around 15-minute design principles is that people are able to access all of their daily activities, all the facilities they need on a daily basis within a 15-minute walk. So by definition, that means you need to be able to walk to work, children need to be able to walk to school, you need to be able to walk to where you get your shopping, where you exercise, etc. So it looks at it from the perspective of the individual or the family, and in terms of their quality of life and how they access services. So it takes a slightly different perspective, but the mechanisms that are used to generate those type of settlements are the same. It's mixed use. It's avoiding the situation where we zone our cities so that we have industrial areas 40 kilometers away from where people live. We have universities, 40 kilometers away from where students are, etc. So absolutely, it covers that, and thank you for the question.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeremy. Then there is, I think it's more of a comment from Dr. Joseph. He said, I'm unsure as to the boundaries of the study. However, the area that requires work is the human behavioral element. Look up learnings from other urban planning exercises which did not yield the results as expected. For this plan to work, the human behavioral element must be addressed, not just as a once-off, but as an ongoing exercise to ensure that the plan yields results as intended. And I think this is the work CSA is trying to be busy with, to raise that awareness and make sure actually also that the policymakers that influence the bylaws at the end of the day know that these opportunities are out there. But also obviously the new generation of urban planners, right? They need to know the tools around that type of thinking as well. I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to comment on that as well.
I think it's a very underrated aspect, but it's probably, one of the most important things is A, awareness, and then B, changing behaviors so that you draw on in terms of reducing waste, in terms of a lot of the efficiencies. And I think one of the things that designers need to think about is they need to make the circular alternatives. They need to make the greener options, the more sustainable options, very, very much more attractive. So it becomes obvious that that's where you want to live. That's how you want to work. And I think that's one of the issues that really needs to be taught and developed, is to show that something like a 15-minute human settlement, the quality of life is so much better that you then don't need to spend half of your income on a car, or on transport or traveling, because the quality of life is so much better. You spend more time with your kids, children can walk to school. But it's very important, I think, to show that difference. And there's a whole science around it. So absolutely, it's a very interesting area of research, and it's definitely something that needs doing.
Yeah, I think it also speaks to how we need to connect systems, right? If we want to have substitution for certain aggregate in a built environment, we need to connect maybe with the mining sector. You spoke a lot about the agriculture sector, but mobility is key here as well. So I think all those components need to be puzzled together to make that, again, the system work, that people are also aware, okay, 15-minute cities are actually something to strive for, so that we don't actually need to have cars. Then there is another question from Flick. Thank you, Jeremy, very thought-provoking. I'm hoping for ways to upscale urban agriculture and in trying to encourage more urban agriculture. What progress has been made for improved financial incentives for businesses and households to participate in composting schemes? And then second, how can regulatory barriers such as waste management bylaws be removed to support local composting initiative? I'm not quite sure if you know exactly around financial incentives or if you guys have looked into that.
Okay, I'll give you a kind of broad answer. The research that we carried out shows there hasn't been a lot of movement. So we're still very old-fashioned when it comes to things like composting, etc. And I think what it'll take is really to pilot schemes and make sure that these are publicized widely to show the benefits, etc. And I think they're happening in different, small scales. They're happening in Durban, they're happening in Johannesburg. And I think what we need to do is we need to kind of have demonstration projects, show the benefits, and then probably they'll be taken up by neighborhoods, by communities, and eventually they'll filter through into municipalities. So I think that particular initiative will probably be driven by communities more perhaps than a top-down approach from cities.
Yeah, I think Sherry also just mentioned in his chat if financial incentives could help to encourage change. Did you look at this at all? I think that is in general something that we need to consider a little bit more. How do we even separate waste? And it doesn't need to be a very elaborative system, right? But so much organic waste is literally being wasted in our landfill sites. So I think there's, again, lots of opportunities. And what we've seen, I think, a lot in the Western Cape is also black soldier flies and scalable solutions as well. So there's quite a lot of exciting, I think, innovations coming around that can also be implemented in urban spaces. Let me just go back to the Q&A again. Rob has asked, do you perceive SaaS and mobile apps have a role to play, and is most of this applicable in a peri-urban and rural areas with relevant tweaks? I think that's quite a
technical question. I'll give a quick answer, not a detailed one. Is there's huge potential with IoT, so Internet of Things, sensors, loggers, etc. So a lot of the product as a service models rely on that sort of technology, and they make it very affordable. So they make it very easy for entrepreneurs to enter a particular market and make the business study work. So if you're interested in that field, I think there's a lot of potential in future.
Great, thank you. I think we're coming to the end of the webinar. I do think there's more to actually unpack, such as maybe digital twins as well around maintenance, and then also the deconstruction side of things, where maybe material banks need to be part of that, right? Where we really map out where the resources lie and when they'll be deconstructed, where we actually use them next. So I think from that perspective, there are many more innovations that can also be unpacked. As I said, we're going to share the report with everyone in the email. The webinar is also going to be published online, but obviously if you have questions to Jeremy directly, connect with him on LinkedIn or also Linda. I really want to thank Linda and Jeremy for making their expertise available and being here today. Really appreciate the collaboration with the CSIR and the work that the team has done. I think it is extremely impactful for South Africa. And then to support CSA, please rate our webinar. That really helps us to continue also the platform so that we can keep on continuing those discussions. I'm not sure if Jeremy or Linda have some closing remarks to say right at the end. Okay, Linda nods. Okay. And then again, thanks everyone for joining, and then looking forward to seeing you next week. We are having a lunch club also on mobility, where we're going to, not on mobility, on human settlements, apologies, where we're going to present also a practical case study around circularity in the human settlement sector. And then next week, as Linda has already said, we are going to speak to mobility as well. So we're going to keep you posted. Thanks everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.